About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Well, this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research and explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items, and I'll answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. That's Noetic, moments.org. Well, in the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is defined as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. We see that on TV all the time. Do you know what your name is? Do you know what day it is? That sort of thing. But in the field of noetics, consciousness is much, much more. Not only is it the products and processes of mind that enter our awareness, it's also those outside of our awareness, and it often includes profound human experiences that shape our lives. But most importantly, our research in noetics is telling us that consciousness is what connects us all. So far in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness is and how it works. We started with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's ideas from the early 20th century, explaining how much of what goes on in the mind is not in our normal awareness at all. It is, in fact, unconscious. We worked through to Charles Tart's 1960s descriptions of the various states of consciousness that we might be in at any given time. And then Julian Jaynes related consciousness to the separation of right and left hemispheres of our brain, which do very different things. We then looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed by Rupert Sheldrake, Kurt Levine, and others, trying to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel. Which brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness, as described in the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami. We then looked at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Teilhard de Chardin, Peter Russell, and Ervin Laszlo, which led us to the field of transpersonal psychology, which applies these understandings in therapy and further research. We came back to look at how the hormones of the brain affect the body, with the work of Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who talked about molecules of emotion and a biology of belief, which led to understanding what is increasingly called coherence, a state of consciousness in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are in alignment. We've explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness, demonstrating telepathic communication between two people, mind affecting matter, and the experience of remote viewing or clairvoyance. And so that led us to what are the different states of consciousness that we operate in every day, and exploring frequencies and how we can move into higher and lower states or frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and in the heart. And we used the work of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, and the water crystals of Masaru Emoto to help us understand those. For several episodes, we looked at the healing process and the role that consciousness and energy and thought and feeling play in the body's response to threats and distress. And then we looked specifically at the structure and the functioning of the brain, which is the bridge between the mind and body, although materialist and physicalist scientists continue to think the brain is the origin of all mind and consciousness. Most recently, we've been exploring how the mind, not being a function of the brain, continues, even though the brain may not be functioning at all, when the heart and brain have flatlined and the person is declared dead. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. You want to click on that little cloud that's up on the banner at the top of the screen. And on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you will also find links to the books and clips and authors that I mention on the show. Today, I'm going to be exploring some of the emerging ideas about how the brain and mind interact, how it is that mind, which we found is a field that is everywhere, and the set of cells that live in our skull can work together. Now, you may recall that we looked at Ervin Laszlo's notion that the quantum field, or quantum plenum being Greek for fullness, is not an empty vacuum at all. According to Laszlo and many others, the quantum field is what contains all the potential for all the matter and energy in the universe. And more, Laszlo's idea is that what the Hindus and Buddhists call Akash in Sanskrit is identical with the quantum plenum. That is, all the thoughts, ideas, memories, and knowledge of humanity, and perhaps all beings everywhere, is stored as patterns in the quantum substrate out of which matter, energy, and our bodies emerge. It's a grand idea. And much of what we've explored so far is supported by and supports the concept, but Laszlo doesn't try to answer how it happens. Fortunately for us, a physics professor who was on sabbatical at the beginning of the COVID era decided to explore whether the statistical mathematics that he used to describe large-scale problems in physics and solve them could apply to the large-scale activities that go on in machine learning and artificial neural networks. I'll let him tell you about it.
Think about the math tools that we use in physics that can be useful for understanding artificial neural networks, machine learning. And moreover, you can not only understand how they work, you can use the results to design better architecture to make artificial neural networks work better. But that was like one project. But once I finished it, I saw that something interesting is arising there, something I didn't quite expect. I saw that in certain limits, the artificial neural networks can be modeled by using quantum mechanics. Not the Schrödinger equation that you hear about, but Madelung equation, something that has to do with more of a hidden variable approach or Bohmian mechanics approach to quantum mechanics. So is it a coincidence, or is it maybe not, or maybe there is something deeper into that? And so then I went to this second question, say, okay, so I kind of have my own understanding of how physics can be useful to understand machine learning. Can we reverse the order? Can we now use machine learning to model and physical processes, physical system? And again, I was still far away from the idea of a cosmological neural network. It was just, okay, so we have physics, we have known phenomena in physics like quantum mechanics, have general relativity. Can we model both of them? Maybe neural networks, microscopic neural networks, can have emergent behavior, which on one side will give you quantum mechanics, on the other side will give you general relativity and gravity, and maybe also it will give you observers. And that would be great because people often talk about unification of gravity and quantum mechanics, but kind of put aside the problem of observers, and it keeps coming back to us. There is a measurement problem in quantum mechanics that has to do with observers. There is a measure problem in cosmology, which also has to do with observers. So I always had this feeling that the three things might have to be unified together, and we just need a better mathematical framework for doing this. And so that was the idea. And then and I just took the mathematical model of neural networks that I've developed, and so can I apply it to now get those behaviors? And yeah, quantum mechanics was one limit that was there. Now closer to equilibrium. So if you wait long enough, that the system will behave and will be described, its evolution will be described by equation of quantum mechanics with hidden variables. So there will be hidden variables that and if you don't know those hidden variables, that is why your wave function can collapse in different ways. But if you knew them, then you would know exactly how your experiment, that would be the outcome of your experiment.
That was Vitaly Vanchurin, a physics professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth, a graduate of physics, PhD at Stanford University, who went to a mathematics high school where he was growing up in Russia. So he thinks in terms of equations, and he thinks in terms of these large-scale modeling equations that can make sense of things that you and I can barely comprehend. This idea that he came up with, that he could use physics equations to explain how machine learning happened, and then once he had that model, that set of equations, to apply it to the physics of the world, of the universe, was delightful and amazing. His paper came out in 2020, and we haven't heard much since it first came out. I'm intrigued. I think maybe people are exploring it, and we should be seeing some papers coming out here in the next year or so, exploring the limits to what he has done and the possibilities that he has opened up. The very math that gave us the relativity theory and much of quantum mechanics, when applied to learning systems and then taking that model and seeing where it goes toward equilibrium, gives us quantum mechanics. Far from equilibrium gives us human scale systems that we can see and touch. And it's all based on a structure of microscopic neural networks. Now, if you've seen a photo of the gravity patterns across the universe, or of what is called dark energy in the universe, you may have seen the same thing that I did. Oh my goodness, it looks like the neural network in our brain. I'll include a link to one of those photos on the website. The implication, of course, is that mind, the quantum brain, the Akashic record, is the underlying field of all that is. And our brains, our individual brains, the cells in our skulls, have access to that. They are literally functioning as micro versions of the universal brain. Very exciting. So the universal mind and the human mind are one mind. And that leads to a whole body of material that is usually called new thought. And I will get into that another day. Now, what I want to do next, though, is introduce you to one of the techniques that has been used for thousands of years to help people access that universal mind. I'm going to be drawing on the description provided by Joe Dispenza, not because it's particularly unique, but because we know that he has done a lot of very careful experiments around this technique, and he makes it available online.
So think of the pineal gland as a radio receiver. And the pineal gland is a tiny gland that sits between the back of your throat and the back of your head. And the pineal gland's primary function in normal three-dimensional reality is it manufactures two neurotransmitters called serotonin and melatonin. I mean, it has some other functions, but let's talk about that. Right. Now, the moment you wake up in the morning and your eyes open up and the wavelength of visible light is perceived in your eye, That wavelength of light hits the optic nerve, and the optic nerve sends a signal to a nucleus, which then sends a signal to another part of the brain, and then all of a sudden, the pineal gland gets the signal to make a chemical called serotonin. Mm-hmm. Serotonin is the daytime neurotransmitter. Right. Our brain will go into what's called beta brainwave patterns, and now we're alert, we're aware, we are aware that we have a body, we're aware that there's an environment, and we're very aware of time. Now, the inhibition of light, or the loss of light, when it gets dark, all of a sudden there's no more wavelength of light, the pineal gland switches off, and it takes serotonin and it begins to make another chemical called melatonin. Melatonin is the nighttime neurotransmitter, and melatonin then begins to change our brain waves into alpha, theta, and ultimately delta, and the body now can go into restorative sleep. So serotonin gets us up, melatonin puts us to sleep, and it's a function of what's called the circadian rhythm. Mm-hmm. How the sun rises and sets, people get used to that rhythm, right?
Yes.
So, however, there's latent systems in the brain when the pineal gland becomes activated, it has tiny little crystals in it that are calcite crystals, calcium carbonate crystals, and they're kind of rhombohedrons. They're 6-sided, 8-sided, and they're stacked on top of each other. And I found the research to show that the pineal gland has some very unusual properties. So when the pineal gland becomes activated, those tiny little crystals begin to shimmer, and they begin to become electrically activated. And once they become electrically activated, they become sensitive to frequencies. Mm-hmm. Not frequencies of light. Light has to go through the eyes, through the senses. Once it's activated, it begins to pick up frequencies that are not perceived by the senses, and it transduces that frequency, because that frequency is carrying information, into very profound imagery. And now the person is having an inner vision. That's why it's called the third eye. And that inner vision is way more real than anything you've ever experienced in your three-dimensional reality. This is a very, very low frequency, but this is a very fast frequency. And all of a sudden, the pineal gland begins to make metabolites. Now, melatonin is already an antioxidant, but now the derivatives of melatonin, when this gland is activated, produces very powerful antioxidants that heal: anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-heart disease, anti-stroke, anti-neurodegenerative, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial. You take the molecule, you tweak it again, you have a benzodiazepine. What is that? That's Valium. It's your body. Melatonin already relaxes you, but now, hang on. You are going to really chill out. You're going to be, survival centers in your body are going to be shut off, because that's what benzodiazepines do. They shut off your survival centers. So now you feel relaxed. It produces a chemical that puts the body into stasis. The first 3 centers, you lose sex drive, you lose appetite, you lose the preoccupation with your environment. The body is no longer, the mind, it's no longer driving us. Now you can dream without being interfered with your body. It produces a chemical that's the same chemical found in electric eels. Now the nervous system becomes amplified. Now it's electric. Your brain is going to switch on, and you're going to have a lot of energy in there. And it produces that same chemical called dimethyltryptamine, which is a very powerful hallucinogenic. And now your brain is going to literally perceive another world, and it's going to be more real than this world. And we activate that system because I want people to realize that they're not a linear being.
So the pineal gland, that little tiny pine cone shaped thing that is behind the throat toward the back of the skull, is the means by which the brain receives the signals that are then translated into information picked up by the other cells in the brain. This is so cool. We have the beginning of an accurate description of how the one mind that is all that is and the human mind begin to relate. Now, what Joe Dispenza does, and what thousands of people have done over thousands of years to access and activate the pineal gland, is basically what we call meditation. That is to go into a state of deep relaxation. And he has techniques which he uses to help, quote, pump the pineal gland and get it more activated. And you can find all kinds of things online to manage that process if you're interested in following up. But as with everything else in the mind-body system, intention is 9/10 of the process. Well, that sound tells us that it's time to check in. You are listening to Noetic Moments with Ruth Miller on KXCR FM 90.7 on the dial and streaming on KXCR.net. And that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. One of the things that's in the news is, quote, long COVID. Now, I have been tracking what are the symptoms of long COVID, and they clearly parallel the symptoms that many people have been experiencing who at some point were diagnosed with something like Epstein-Barr or Lyme disease, or in one case, extreme encephalitis. And it turns out that what is being called long COVID with these same symptoms could possibly be also called post-infectious myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's ended many careers. It has gone undiagnosed for many people. They're sometimes just called chronic fatigue syndrome. Some of the symptoms are quite painful and others are not so much. One patient describes it as overwhelming muscle weakness, almost paralyzing fatigue, brain dysfunction so severe I had trouble remembering a 4-digit PIN for 10 seconds, electric shock-like sensations running up and down my legs. At one point as I tried to work, he says, letters on my computer monitor began swirling around. That only years later I learned was called oscillopsia. My heart rate soared when I stood, making it difficult to remain upright. That's just one description of the kinds of symptoms these people are dealing with. It's not COVID. It is the body's reaction to an intense viral infection. This is something to be aware of. Now, there aren't very many ways to cure it, for what that's worth. But in order to help it, we have to have doctors understand it. So what's happened here is the immune systems have gone haywire. And in fact, that is one of the hallmarks of COVID, that the treatments that were in fact killing people were the kinds of things that would normally boost the immune system. But the COVID turned the immune system into an autoimmune disease, basically. So boosting the immune system was not helping those patients. Now we have to understand that people with this condition have immune systems that have gone haywire. Their nervous systems are dysfunctional. And sometimes it takes 6 months or more for anyone to be able to do anything. Now, exercise is not the answer. It's very difficult for folks who are dealing with this to have exercise. A researcher at the Brookings Institute estimated that 2 to 4 million Americans can no longer work due to long COVID, and that's on top of the people who are disabled from previous kinds of infections. So it's a growing problem. Now, what we do know is that the NIH did a study, and they're in the process of analyzing the results. I'm hoping that some of what the NIH found will be helpful to some of the people who are dealing with this. What I found for myself when I was dealing with some similar symptoms way back when was a combination of emotional and spiritual work along with some body work in the form of what was then called gentle rolfing. But basically, it's deep tissue massage to restructure the alignment of the muscles and the fascia. This combination made it possible for me to begin to function. And then I developed some tools that helped me to get stronger and stronger. So I no longer have these issues. But I have many people in my world who have struggled with these issues. And I hope that the fact that we now know what it is, and the fact that the NIH has done some studies on ways to address it, can make a big difference for others. And if you did hear our shows on healing a while back, you will hear some of the techniques that I know work, and I can provide some others in the future. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life differently when we use it fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of past shows that you can link to, and we also have links to the other resources that we refer to on the show. And you can send me comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.